In the winter of 1986, the Kennedy Space Center in Florida stood quiet under a gray, wind-brushed sky. The Atlantic breeze moved gently across the launch complex, rustling the sawgrass near the edges of the launch pad, where the white tower of Challenger waited. It had been there for days, its launch postponed several times, mostly due to weather. But inside the nearby crew quarters, 7 people were waiting, not just for liftoff, but for history. For months, their names had been shared on morning news segments and in classroom conversations. This wasn't just another shuttle mission. This one was different. This time, a teacher, an ordinary civilian, would be flying with the crew. America watched with pride, with curiosity, with expectations. But long before the countdown clocks began ticking, long before the rocket stood upright on Pad 39B, these 7 crew members were simply people. Scientists, pilots, engineers, teachers, parents. Each had lived quiet lives before the cameras arrived. Each had made their way through years of study, training, and private sacrifice to be part of something they believed in. Michael J. Smith was the pilot, 40 years old, a calm and capable presence. He had flown F-4 Phantom jets off aircraft carriers before coming to NASA. Colleagues described him as composed, easy to work with, the kind of man who made tense situations feel manageable. He had a wife, Jane, and 3 children. At home, he was the one who made pancakes on Sundays. Dick Scobie was the commander. He was 46, a veteran pilot with over 6,500 hours of flight time. He had a soft voice, a dry sense of humor, and a natural ability to lead. His path to NASA had started in the U.S. Air Force, followed by years as a test pilot. Friends remembered how much he loved flying, how deeply he believed in the shuttle program. Ronald McNair was a mission specialist, 35, a physicist and accomplished saxophone player. He had grown up in South Carolina, where, as a child, he had been denied access to a segregated library. He went on to earn his PhD from MIT. He was thoughtful, analytical, and known for quietly lifting up others around him. He and his wife Cheryl had 2 children. Ellison Onizuka, also a mission specialist, was 39. He was born in Hawaii, the first Japanese American in space. He had flown once before aboard Discovery. He loved the culture and humor of his heritage, often bringing Hawaiian treats to share with the crew. He and his wife Lorna had 2 daughters. Judith Resnick, engineer and mission specialist, was 36. She had a brilliant mind and a quiet focus. A classical pianist in her spare time. She was one of the first women ever to fly in space. Her colleagues respected her immediately. She didn't speak often, but when she did, people listened. She had an engineer's precision and an astronaut's calm. Gregory Jarvis was a payload specialist, an engineer from Hughes Aircraft. This was to be his first spaceflight. He had trained and waited patiently through previous mission delays, always ready but never assigned. When he finally got a seat on Challenger, he told his wife Marcia, "It's real now." They'd been married nearly 2 decades. And then there was Christa McAuliffe. Christa was the reason so many schoolchildren were paying attention to this launch. She was a high school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, 37 years old, mother of 2, selected from over 11,000 applicants to be the first civilian teacher in space as part of the Teacher in Space project. She had a bright, approachable presence, a warmth that connected easily to others. Her students adored her. During interviews, she spoke about wanting to make space real for kids, wanting to teach from orbit. She was in many ways the public face of this mission. They had trained together for months, laughed together, worked long days in simulators, memorizing checklists and procedures. They had gone through media training, press events, classroom visits, flight simulations. And through it all, they had become a crew, not just colleagues, but something closer to a family. In early January, they began arriving at Kennedy Space Center. The launch had already been postponed multiple times due to technical checks and weather concerns. The shuttle was ready, but Florida's winter was unusually cold that year. On some mornings, frost lingered on the launch pad, coating handrails and gantries in white. Still, spirits remained high. There was laughter in the cafeteria, handwritten notes taped to lockers. photographs of children and spouses tucked inside flight gear bags. Challenger was to be the 25th shuttle mission. By now, the shuttle program had begun to feel routine to the public. Launches were broadcast, but the urgency had faded. Yet for those inside the program, each mission remained complex, unpredictable, and deeply human. The families of the crew stayed nearby. NASA provided hotel rooms, transportation, and regular briefings. They were proud, nervous, and waiting, just like the crew. Christa's parents had arrived from New Hampshire. Judith Resnick's brother was there too. Marcia Jarvis had a notebook where she kept track of everything: flight times, mission goals, reminders to call her husband before bedtime. The night before the scheduled launch, it was cold again. A rare freeze swept through central Florida. Engineers expressed concern about the temperatures. Ice was reported on parts of the launch structure. Managers discussed it into the early morning hours. But launch was not yet scrubbed. Meanwhile, the crew prepared like they always did. Quietly, systematically. They checked personal kits, rehearsed flight deck checklists, reviewed last-minute briefings. There were hugs that night, photographs, some written notes folded and tucked away. The kind you leave not in fear, but in love, just in case. They slept in the astronaut quarters, a low-slung building with white walls and narrow windows. Outside, the dark sky stretched quiet and indifferent. Challenger stood on the pad, sealed and waiting. They rose before dawn, had breakfast together, scrambled eggs, toast, coffee. It was tradition. They suited up in their bright, orange launch entry suits, smiled for cameras, waved, climbed into the van that would take them to the launch pad. There was no fear on their faces, only purpose. By 8:30 a.m., they were strapped into their seats. Final checks proceeded. The countdown resumed. Far away, in classrooms across the country, televisions were rolled into rooms. Students settled in their chairs, excited to watch their teacher, someone just like them, launch into space. Families at home turned on the morning news. In New Hampshire, Christa's students watched with pride. At 11:38 a.m., the countdown reached zero. Engines ignited. Smoke billowed outward. Challenger lifted from the pad with a low, guttural roar, climbing into the sky on a column of flame. For 73 seconds, everything seemed perfect. The Kennedy Space Center had a certain silence to it in the days leading up to launch. Not the absence of sound, but the kind of quiet that comes from precision. Every footstep, every voice, every movement was controlled. Inside the vehicle assembly building, massive cranes moved slowly. On the launch pad, technicians double-checked sensor data, inspecting cables, seals, temperature gauges. There was no room for improvisation here, only the practiced rhythm of preparation. The Challenger orbiter had been assembled, mated to its fuel tank and boosters, and transported carefully to Launch Complex 39B weeks earlier. It was the first shuttle to launch from that particular pad. NASA had expanded operations in anticipation of increased mission frequency. In 1986, there were plans for shuttle launches nearly every month. The space program was evolving. The sense of risk was being replaced, gradually, quietly, by a sense of routine. But inside the system, not everyone was at ease. Engineers from Morton Thiokol, the company responsible for the solid rocket boosters, had been tracking temperature data closely. One concern kept returning: the O-ring seals, rubber-like gaskets between sections of the boosters, might not behave predictably in cold weather. There had been prior warnings. There had been memos. But the pressure to stay on schedule was real. NASA had already postponed the Challenger launch several times. There were media outlets waiting, school groups watching, and politicians attending. That quiet pressure, the kind no one admits but everyone feels, had begun to take hold. At the astronaut quarters, the mood remained calm. The crew stayed in rooms that were modest but comfortable, neutral tones, thin carpeting, no television. They had books, notepads, and family phone calls. There were routine medical checks, light exercise, and briefings. But mostly they waited. Some wrote in journals. Some played cards. Ellison Onizuka was known for his jokes. McNair practiced saxophone fingerings on an imaginary horn. Christa McAuliffe, always thinking like a teacher, rehearsed her onboard lessons. She had lesson plans tucked inside her flight kit. Short, engaging modules she would deliver from orbit, recorded by onboard cameras and broadcast to schools back on Earth. She called them the ultimate field trip. She had become a symbol of accessibility, proof that space wasn't just for engineers and test pilots. She talked about how students could become anything, how education was a form of exploration. She didn't see herself as brave. She saw herself as curious. And in that curiosity, she had captured the public imagination. Her family stayed nearby in Cocoa Beach. Her parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan, had flown in earlier in the week. They were reserved people, not used to attention, but they smiled politely for cameras and answered questions when asked. They had seen their daughter's photo in papers across the country. She had become something more than Christa. She had become America's teacher. But for them, she was still their child. Gregory Jarvis' wife, Marcia, stayed close to the crew's quarters. She spoke with her husband the night before launch. He had waited a long time for this mission. There had been postponements, reassignments, delays. But he never complained. He was simply grateful. Excited. Ready. Judith Resnick, whose quiet intellect had impressed everyone who worked with her, had spent the afternoon before launch reviewing technical materials. She was meticulous, a former engineer at RCA and the Naval Surface Weapons Center. In her quarters, she had a small mirror and a photo of her parents. Her father, Marvin Resnick, had flown in from Ohio to watch the launch. In the control room, meanwhile, technicians monitored weather closely. It was cold, colder than usual for Central Florida. Overnight temperatures had dropped below freezing. Frost appeared on the gantry. Ice formed around the launch pad's support structures. At 1 a.m., launch personnel raised concerns. At 2 a.m., more calls were made. By 3 a.m., a teleconference between NASA managers and Morton Thiokol engineers was underway. The concern focused on the right solid rocket booster. If the O-rings failed to properly seal during ignition, hot gas could escape. Engineers from Thiokol recommended a delay, but the recommendation was overruled. At 4:30 a.m., the final decision was made. The launch would proceed. Inside the crew quarters, none of this was shared with the astronauts. At 6 a.m., the crew began suiting up. They wore pressure suits in bright orange, each with an American flag patch on the shoulder. Each crew member had trained for this moment hundreds of times. The walk across the gantry, the ride in the Astrovan, the climb into the orbiter, it was all familiar. They smiled. They waved. They posed for photos. In her flight suit, Christa McAuliffe looked composed, smiling softly as she made her way toward the gantry elevator. Behind her, Commander Dick Scobie walked with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the checklist by heart. At 7:30 a.m., they were seated inside the shuttle. McNair and Onizuka sat behind the flight deck. Judith Resnick and Gregory Jarvis in the middeck. Christa sat next to Jarvis. She looked around, taking it all in, speaking through her headset to the Capcom in mission control. The chatter was calm, familiar. Go for launch. The sky was still, the wind low. Schoolchildren across the country were seated cross-legged in front of televisions. Teachers adjusted antennas. News anchors explained what to expect. In New Hampshire, a crowd had gathered in the school auditorium. Parents, teachers, Christa's students. Her husband, Stephen McAuliffe, stood toward the back, arms folded, watching. At 11:38 a.m., the countdown reached 0. There was no sound for a moment, just the sight of the shuttle engines igniting, white plumes rolling outward, the slow, steady lift of 4.5 million pounds of hardware and fuel climbing into the pale sky. Inside the crew cabin, the astronauts felt the vibrations begin. The pressure against their backs. The familiar, almost comforting sound of the main engines roaring beneath them. Everything was proceeding nominally. In the control room, indicators were green. At 11:39 a.m., Challenger cleared the tower. At 11 hours 39 minutes and 20 seconds, it passed through max Q, the moment of maximum aerodynamic pressure. And then at 73 seconds after liftoff, the sky changed. There was no explosion in the dramatic, Hollywood sense. There was a fire, a flash, then a bloom of smoke and debris spreading across the blue sky like a slow, unnatural cloud. At first, no one spoke. In classrooms, the picture froze. On televisions, the live feed crackled. In Mission Control, the voice of Capcom tried to re-establish contact. Challenger, go with throttle up. Silence. Then, flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. The solid boosters twisted free, spinning away in opposite directions. What remained of Challenger scattered into the sky. At the school in New Hampshire, a teacher stepped forward to switch off the television. No one moved. At 11:39 a.m., 73 seconds after liftoff, Challenger was gone. But for many watching, at home, in classrooms, at viewing platforms just miles from the launch pad, it wasn't immediately clear what had happened. The fireball was large, but there was no loud sound on television. Just a white, branching cloud in the sky. Twin trails of smoke spiraling outward from the solid rocket boosters, now flying uncontrolled. On screen, no one spoke for several long seconds. Then came the voice from Mission Control, calm and without emotion. Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. The word malfunction didn't match what people had just seen. And yet there was no better word. No one knew what else to call it. Not yet. In the launch viewing area, families of the crew stood still. Some held binoculars. Others stood with hands pressed against their mouths. At that distance, there was no sound, just the sight of something going wrong in the sky. A flicker, a shape unraveling. Marcia Jarvis looked up in confusion. Gregory's flight path was supposed to arc smoothly toward the horizon. Instead, the shape in the sky bloomed outward, uneven and sudden. Then it split. She said later she wasn't sure when she knew. For Christa McAuliffe's parents, standing with other family members near the bleachers, the moment was almost too surreal to process. They had never seen a shuttle launch before. They didn't know what the smoke was supposed to look like. But others around them had. And when those people began stepping back or turning away or suddenly falling silent, the realization began to settle. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. In the auditorium of Concord High School in New Hampshire, the room was filled with children. They had been laughing, clapping, excited. Some had held signs. Banners hung across the walls. "We love you, Christa." The live television feed had been slightly delayed, but it was clear when the shuttle did not continue its rise. When the cloud of smoke froze on screen, when the commentator stopped speaking, a teacher stepped forward and turned off the screen. The room was silent. Some children began to cry. Others sat still. They waited for someone to tell them what to think. At NASA, the control room remained composed. That was their training. No matter what happened, remain steady. The flight director called for data. Telemetry had been lost. The transponders stopped sending signal at the moment of the breakup. All voice contact was gone. There were no vital signs. No way to reach the orbiter, because there was no orbiter left. At 11:40 a.m., the last fragments of Challenger splashed into the Atlantic Ocean. The mission elapsed time clock was frozen. Back at the launch site, the debris cloud drifted on the wind. Engineers watched as fragments fell in long arcs into the water below. Some trailed smoke. Others simply dropped. Among them were pieces of insulation, wiring, metal struts, and something larger, what would later be identified as a section of fuselage. Helicopters were dispatched immediately from nearby Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. Rescue boats followed, but recovery was not possible in the usual sense. There were no survivors, and by then they already knew that. The first official public statement came just before noon. NASA spokesman Hugh Harris appeared on camera. His voice was steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. The flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point." By early afternoon, President Ronald Reagan had been notified. He canceled his scheduled State of the Union address. Instead, he and his advisors began preparing a speech that would be delivered later that evening. But in the hours between the explosion and the address, there was only confusion and silence. Across the country, phone lines at NASA facilities were flooded. Newsrooms were scrambling. Television stations ran continuous coverage, looping the same 73 seconds of footage over and over. Some blurred the moment of breakup. Others did not. Experts were called in to explain what viewers had seen. Theories spread quickly, but official information was slow. Caution held priority over clarity. In schools, teachers tried to comfort students. In homes, parents tried to answer questions. And in the crew quarters, now quiet, sealed off, their uniforms remained in lockers, their belongings untouched. Judith Resnick's music cassette player, Ellison Onizuka's notebook, Michael Smith's watch laid neatly beside his bunk. These objects remained long after the people who used them were gone. By mid-afternoon, the launch pad had been cleared. Only a few engineers remained, tasked with gathering data. The launch control team sat in silence, reviewing tapes, checking logs, verifying system readings frame by frame. Outside, near the coast, debris floated. Search and recovery operations would continue for weeks. The ocean floor would be combed. Sections of the Challenger would eventually be retrieved from the Atlantic, including part of the crew cabin. But in that first day, there was nothing to recover but understanding. For the families, the shock moved slowly. NASA brought them into a private briefing room and explained what had happened in careful, measured words. They were told the breakup had occurred quickly, that it had been unexpected, that more information would come soon. No promises were made, only silence and stillness. The room held quiet for a long time after the explanation ended. Some wept, some didn't, some simply sat, staring ahead. One family member asked, "Are you sure?" The reply was quiet, "Yes." By that evening, millions of Americans had watched the footage. Over and over. The launch that had been expected to unite and inspire now marked one of the darkest moments in the history of spaceflight. At 5 p.m., President Reagan addressed the nation. In his speech, he spoke not as a politician, but as a grandfather, a teacher, a witness. His words were written to comfort, not to analyze, to steady, not to explain. He ended with a line that would be remembered long after. They slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. The next morning, flags were at half-mast. In classrooms across the country, students returned to school, quieter now. The desks had not moved. The televisions had been wheeled away. But something in the air had changed. The space program was no longer a symbol of only triumph. It had become something else, still noble, still necessary, but now visibly fragile. The Challenger 7 were gone, but their presence lingered, in the paused silence of those final seconds, in the sky where the clouds still drifted, and in the memory of a nation that had watched, helpless, as 7 lives rose together and vanished. The morning after the Challenger disaster was cold and quiet. Newsstands carried headlines in bold type. Shuttle explodes. Tragedy in the sky. The day the sky went silent. Photographs of the explosion, frozen mid-bloom, filled the front pages. The faces of the crew, smiling, posed, were arranged beside the column of smoke that marked their end. Across the country, people woke not to disbelief, but to grief. In schools, counselors met with students who had watched the launch the day before. Many had not slept. Some thought it had been a mistake, a malfunction of the broadcast, a misunderstanding. Others had gone home and watched it again, the reality sinking in slowly with each rewatch. At Concord High School, where Christa McAuliffe had taught history and civics, the auditorium remained dim. Students filed in quietly. The banner that had read "Good luck, Christa" was still taped to the wall. It hung unevenly, fluttering lightly from a vent above. No one removed it. Not yet. The school principal, Herb Richardson, stood before the students and faculty. His voice was steady but quiet. He told them what they already knew, but in a way that asked them to breathe through it, to sit with it. Some cried. Some sat still. No one left the room quickly. In Houston, at Johnson Space Center, flags hung at half-staff. The mood among staff was subdued. NASA, always practiced in containment and protocol, did what it knew how to do: document, debrief, pause. all shuttle flights were suspended. Launch operations were halted indefinitely. Public tours were canceled. And behind closed doors, the agency began the slow, difficult work of asking what had gone wrong. But in those early days, there was no official cause. Only grief. The families were the first to retreat from the public eye. NASA provided support, grief counselors, travel assistants, liaison officers. Each family processed the loss differently. Some spoke to the press briefly. Others refused contact entirely. But all shared one thing, a loss that had occurred not in private, but in front of the world. There was no chance to shield children from the images. No way to protect parents from the questions. The explosion had been recorded from dozens of angles, NASA footage, news crews, amateur film. Within hours, it had been played repeatedly across networks. And there it remained, replayed again and again, a cycle of ascent and collapse. Some called it necessary to confront the truth. Others called it cruel. NASA held a memorial at the Johnson Space Center within days of the disaster. A stage was set in a courtyard, lined with 7 framed portraits. White flowers surrounded the podium. Family members sat in the front rows. Colleagues, friends, and NASA administrators behind them. President Reagan and First Lady Nancy Reagan attended. The mood was quiet, not solemn in ceremony, but personal. Those who spoke did not focus on the shuttle or the mission. They spoke of the people. Dick Scobie's calm presence, Judith Resnick's intellect, Ellison Onizuka's humor, Mike Smith's steadiness, Greg Jarvis' patience, Ron McNair's spirit, Christa McAuliffe's joy. No eulogies tried to explain what had happened, because no one yet knew. Behind the podium, the U.S. and NASA flags moved slightly in the breeze. And around the country, Americans paused. Church bells rang in New Hampshire. In Honolulu, schoolchildren laid flowers before a photo of Onizuka. In Akron, Ohio, a scholarship fund was started in Judith Resnick's name. In South Carolina, Ron McNair's hometown held a candlelight vigil. In California, the Hughes Aircraft Company, where Gregory Jarvis had worked, lowered its flag and left his desk untouched for a week. This wasn't just a NASA event. It had reached into living rooms, classrooms, and family dinners. The public had known these 7, not personally, but closely enough. Their names had been repeated on the news, their faces shown in every newspaper. They had become familiar, and so their loss felt personal. NASA, in turn, began to retreat inward. Administrator William Graham initiated the formal investigation process. An internal review began immediately, but within days, the White House announced that an independent panel would be formed. It would be known as the Rogers Commission, chaired by former Secretary of State William P. Rogers. It was the first sign that what had occurred was not just a technical failure. It would become a matter of public trust. In the interim, the search and recovery mission off the coast of Florida continued. The Atlantic waters were cold and deep. Navy divers, Coast Guard vessels, and salvage teams worked around the clock. Debris was scattered over hundreds of square miles. Floating fragments of insulation, personal items, structural components. Most of it had sunk. On January 31st, 4 days after the accident, search teams located larger sections of the Challenger in the ocean. Among the recovered items was part of the left wing. Another team found a section of the fuselage. In time, most of the main wreckage would be brought to the surface, piece by piece, cataloged and stored in a secure hangar for analysis. But recovery did not mean closure. When remains of the crew were found in the wreckage of the crew cabin, they were returned with care under military escort. There was no ceremony, no announcement, just quiet respect. Each family chose how to mourn. Some held private funerals. Others chose memorial services open to the community. NASA supported each decision, providing whatever was needed, asking for little in return. In the weeks that followed, America moved forward, but not quickly. There was a shift, subtle but deep. Space no longer felt like a clean arc of promise. It felt like something else. A place where real risk lived. A place that could take, just as easily as it could inspire. NASA employees continued to report for work. The hangars remained lit. But the launches, for the first time in years, stopped. Engineers revisited every diagram, every checklist, every assumption. The agency began to reckon with something difficult, not just a technical error, but a culture that had let it slip by. The Rogers Commission began assembling in Washington. Its purpose was not to assign blame, but to find clarity. But that would come later. For now, in early February 1986, the nation remained suspended in reflection. Photographs of the Challenger 7 remained taped to the walls of classrooms. The drawings by children, rockets, stars, and the words "We'll miss you" were still pinned to bulletin boards. Parents answered the same questions every night. Teachers rewrote their lesson plans. Newscasters lowered their voices. And on some nights, people stepped outside and looked up. The stars hadn't changed. But the sky now held something it hadn't before: absence. The Rogers Commission held its first formal meeting on February 6, 1986. Chaired by William P. Rogers, former Secretary of State, the panel had been handpicked by the Reagan administration. It included a mixture of backgrounds: military, scientific, engineering, and political. Among them was Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon. Another was Richard Feynman, a theoretical physicist known for his clarity of thought and unwillingness to accept vague answers. The tone of the commission was careful, but determined. Their goal was not simply to identify what had happened during those 73 seconds. It was to understand why it had happened, and perhaps more importantly, how it had been allowed to happen. In the early meetings, they reviewed the footage, over and over, from multiple angles, slowed down to fractions of a second. It was clear that something had gone wrong with the right solid rocket booster. A flicker of flame had emerged, small, thin, almost invisible at full speed. But frame by frame, it grew, expanding against the external tank, until it tore through. By February 9th, the Commission had received internal reports from NASA detailing prior concerns with the SRBs, the solid rocket boosters manufactured by Morton Thiokol. There had been mention of O-rings, a sealant issue, but the language was technical, restrained. It would take time before those words came into focus. Inside NASA, meanwhile, there was tension. The organization had spent the past decade cultivating public confidence. The Shuttle program was intended to make spaceflight routine, frequent, accessible, reusable. It had been sold as the next era of exploration. And now that image had fractured. NASA administrators knew that, but they also feared something deeper, that if the public lost trust, if Congress pulled funding, the Shuttle program could collapse. So, early responses were defensive. Wording was careful. Interviews were scripted. Engineers were instructed not to speak to press without clearance. But the facts didn't wait. Engineers from Morton Thiokol had already begun speaking among themselves. The conference call from the night before the launch, the one where Thiokol had initially recommended delaying the flight due to cold weather, was now being discussed behind closed doors. One engineer, Roger Boisterly, had taken personal notes during the call. He had warned that the O-ring seals were not designed for freezing temperatures, that they could become brittle. That blow-by, the escape of hot gases, could occur if the seal didn't flex quickly enough. During the call, Thiokol managers had supported the recommendation to delay. But then, after pressure from NASA officials and a tense internal discussion, they reversed their position. The launch was cleared. When the Rogers Commission learned this, it became a turning point. They summoned Thiokol representatives and asked them directly, "Did you know the O-rings could fail in cold weather?" The answer eventually was yes. From that moment on, the investigation changed shape. Richard Feynman, skeptical by nature, took the matter into his own hands. He met privately with engineers, took handwritten notes, and requested data sets. He noticed how terminology like acceptable risk was used in place of plain speech. In one now famous moment during a televised hearing, Feynman placed an O-ring sample in a glass of ice water, let it chill, then pulled it out and showed the audience how it lost its elasticity. A simple gesture, but clear. "The physics," he said, "is not negotiable." The commissioners fell silent. Behind closed doors, NASA officials grew uneasy. What had been an internal technical concern had become a public failure of judgment. Not only had there been warnings, but those warnings had been softened, buried in layers of formality, or simply ignored. Over the next few weeks, the commission compiled testimony. Managers, engineers, administrators. Some were defensive. Others were apologetic. A few were candid enough to say they had tried to raise alarms, but didn't have the authority to stop the launch. For the families of the crew, this part of the process was especially difficult. The accident had taken their loved ones. Now they were learning it might not have been unavoidable. That someone somewhere could have said stop, and didn't. Marcia Jarvis later said it wasn't the explosion that haunted her. It was the paperwork, the memos, the decisions that had made the launch possible in the face of known risk. In public, the families remained quiet. Dignified, they attended hearings when invited. They answered questions when asked. But mostly they watched as the machinery of investigation moved forward, slow and heavy. NASA itself began undergoing internal review. The culture that had developed around shuttle launches, one that prized schedule over scrutiny, confidence over caution, was being examined. There had been signs investigators found. Prior missions had experienced O-ring erosion. Data had been flagged, memos written, concerns raised. But nothing had failed catastrophically, so the danger was rationalized. That rationalization, the commission wrote, had become part of the culture. Each successful mission reinforced the illusion that problems were under control. The commission called it normalization of deviance. It was not a technical failure, they said. It was organizational. And so, the Challenger accident became more than a tragedy. It became a case study in how systems, well-meaning, highly skilled systems, can convince themselves that risk is acceptable until it isn't. The final report, released in June 1986, confirmed what many had come to understand. The O-ring failed. The cold weather contributed, and human decisions had allowed it to happen. NASA was instructed to overhaul its safety protocols, to restructure its reporting systems, to ensure that dissenting voices could reach leadership. More than 30 recommendations were made. Many were implemented. Some were not. The shuttle program would not fly again for more than 2 years. The Rogers Commission did not assign individual blame, but it did assign collective responsibility. In the final pages of the report, the names of the crew were listed again, not as a technical detail, but as the reason. By late summer of 1986, the shuttle launch pads at Kennedy Space Center stood dormant. No fuel pumps rumbled. No countdown clocks blinked. No voice filled the speaker system with final checks. Instead, the gantries were still. The launch complexes were quiet, like closed stages after a performance that had ended too suddenly. The Challenger disaster had grounded the space program indefinitely. No shuttle had flown since January 28, and none would for a long time. Inside NASA, the mood had changed. The confidence that once defined the shuttle era had dimmed. Not entirely, but visibly. Engineers still arrived at their desks. Technicians still maintained equipment. Astronauts still trained. But the energy had shifted. What had once been momentum was now reflection. Across the country, the public tone had changed as well. Before Challenger, spaceflight had felt increasingly familiar. Shuttle launches were broadcast on television, but viewership had declined over time. By the mid-1980s, they had become routine enough that people barely looked up unless something novel was happening, like the Teacher in Space program. After Challenger, everything stopped. Not just the launches, but the assumptions. No one spoke about the shuttle as if it were ordinary anymore. In classrooms, teachers returned to earthbound subjects. In Washington, congressional hearings continued with quieter language. And in homes, photographs of the Challenger 7 remained on bookshelves and refrigerator doors, reminders not of adventure, but of consequence. The Rogers Commission had published its findings in June, just 5 months after the accident. It confirmed what many already suspected, that the shuttle had been launched under unsafe conditions. That concerns had been raised and dismissed. That the O-rings in the right solid rocket booster had failed to seal. That the flame that followed destroyed the external tank and tore the orbiter apart. But the report was more than technical. It described the culture inside NASA, how communication had broken down, how managers and engineers operated in separate worlds, how risk had become a matter of schedule, not science. Inside the astronaut core, there was anger. Not loud, but deeply felt. Many had trained alongside those who were lost. Some had been backups on STS-51L. Others had been assigned to upcoming missions that no longer existed. They had entered the program to explore, not to wait. But now everything was waiting. The shuttle fleet, Discovery, Atlantis, Columbia, was grounded. Technicians began disassembling critical components. Booster joints were redesigned. O-rings were re-engineered. Emergency escape systems, long questioned but set aside as unnecessary, were reconsidered. NASA's leadership changed. Administrator William Graham stepped down. A new administrator, James Fletcher, was brought back. He had served in the role before, during the program's early design years. His job now was to guide the agency through reform, without collapsing morale. At Johnson Space Center in Houston, changes were slower. Some within NASA pushed back quietly against what they saw as overcorrection. Others accepted the need for change, but no one doubted the cost. In the astronaut office, names were never far from memory. There was Mike Smith, whose quiet strength had steadied every mission he touched. Judith Resnick, brilliant in private, whose laugh could fill a room when she let it. Ron McNair, who had broken barriers before stepping aboard Challenger. Ellison Onizuka, who spoke often of Hawaii and had plans to take his daughters surfing when he returned. Gregory Jarvis, who had waited patiently for his seat in space and never made it back. Christa McAuliffe, whose classroom had become a national symbol. And Commander Dick Scobie, who had carried the weight of the mission and had never flinched. Their photographs remained in the astronaut wing. Their names were etched into mission logs that would never be updated. Their lockers, for a time, were left untouched. NASA did not try to replace them quickly. Instead, there was a space where they had been. A space in training sessions, in mission briefings, in morning routines. For the families, the silence had changed as well. The first months had been filled with calls, ceremonies, interviews, visits. Then slowly the world moved on. Grief shifted. It became quieter, less visible but still constant. Some families became advocates for safety reform. Others withdrew from public life entirely. They chose privacy over platforms. The loss was not theoretical for them. It was not about risk tolerance or institutional accountability. It was personal. One by one, they returned to lives that would never be the same. Marcia Jarvis went back to work quietly. Cheryl McNair, Ron's widow, continued her advocacy for education and science programs. Christa McAuliffe's husband, Stephen, chose to speak rarely, if at all, about the tragedy. He returned to his work as a lawyer and later became a federal judge. Their children, just young teens at the time, were spared from most of the public exposure. That had always been the intent. In Concord, New Hampshire, a school was renamed in Christa's honor. A library, too. And yet, those close to her often said she wouldn't have wanted grandeur. She had wanted students to feel wonder, not to remember her name. The Challenger Center for Space Science Education was founded in 1986 by the families of the crew. Their goal wasn't to look back, but to look forward, to inspire students to explore, to question, to dream. The center began offering interactive learning experiences, where students could engage in simulated space missions, led by the spirit of curiosity. In this way, the crew continued. But within NASA, a different kind of legacy was taking root. Engineers changed how they documented risk. Flight directors changed how they discussed descent. Protocols were adjusted, and then adjusted again. But culture moves slowly, and not all lessons are immediate. By 1987, some began to ask when the shuttles would fly again, but others weren't ready. The pause after Challenger was not just operational. It was existential. What did it mean to explore if exploration could end like this? What were the limits of acceptable risk? Who decides when it's worth trying again? These were questions that couldn't be answered by policy. And so the gantries remained still. No fire, no noise, just sky, waiting. On September 29, 1988, the sky over Cape Canaveral was clear. The white body of Space Shuttle Discovery stood vertical once again on the pad at Launch Complex 39B. The same pad from which Challenger had lifted off more than 2.5 years earlier. But this time there were no banners, no schoolchildren, no widespread celebrations. The atmosphere was deliberate, steady, almost reverent. This mission, STS-26, was not about proving ambition. It was about showing that the lessons of loss had been learned. The return to flight was quiet by design. NASA officials avoided overpromising. There were no grand speeches, no sweeping gestures, just a sense that this was necessary, that the silence could not continue forever. But no one, especially those within the agency, believed it could ever be what it once was. The Challenger disaster had marked a break, not a pause. What followed was not simply an adjustment of systems, but of belief. Inside NASA, the shift had taken root deeply. For nearly 3 years, engineers, managers, technicians, and astronauts had lived with the echo of what had gone wrong. Not just the technical failure of a solid rocket booster, but the organizational culture that allowed danger to blend with routine. Since 1986, every component of the shuttle program had been re-examined. The solid rocket boosters were redesigned, this time with a new seal system, increased tolerance to cold, and independent review protocols. The infamous O-rings were no longer a point of quiet discomfort. They were now a case study, cited in engineering textbooks, displayed in safety briefings, and discussed openly across departments. But the more profound change was structural. The Rogers Commission had called for NASA to create direct lines of communication between engineers and decision-makers, so that never again would critical concerns be softened by layers of middle management. A new Office of Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance was formed, reporting directly to the administrator. Risk could no longer be a passing conversation. It had to be accounted for, formally and without exception. Those changes were in place as Discovery sat on the launch pad. The crew for STS-26 had been carefully chosen. 5 astronauts, all with prior spaceflight experience, all respected within the astronaut corps. They understood the stakes, not just of the mission, but of the symbolism. They carried with them not only equipment and satellites, but the weight of the 7 who never came back. Commander Frederick Hawk had flown twice before. He had been one of the first to say publicly that the next flight could only happen when NASA had truly re-earned the trust of its people. He wasn't interested in rhetoric. He wanted process, and he wanted accountability. Beside him was pilot Richard Covey and mission specialists John Lounge, David Hilmers, and George Pinky Nelson. They had trained in silence, rehearsed emergency scenarios, and absorbed the details of what had happened in 1986, not as abstract events, but as memory. Each of them knew the names. They had worked with Smith, Resnick, McNair, Scobie. They had seen the empty chairs in the astronaut wing. They had passed the lockers that were never reassigned. They did not speak often about it, but they carried it. Not with guilt, but with a quiet, enduring responsibility. At 11:37 a.m., after a flawless countdown, Discovery launched into the sky. There were no cheers in mission control, no loud applause, just the soft clicking of keyboards, the low murmur of confirmation calls, and the voice of the flight director saying what had not been said in nearly 3 years. "We have liftoff." From the public viewing area, a few family members of the Challenger crew watched silently. They had not come to celebrate. They came because they needed to know that it could be done again, and done right. No announcements were made about their presence. They asked for no attention, just a space to witness quietly. The launch went exactly as planned. The shuttle cleared the tower. The redesigned boosters performed as expected. The main engines burned cleanly, and within minutes, Discovery was safely in orbit. For the first time in 32 months, the shuttle program had taken flight again. But it was not a return to normal. Normal had changed. The days following the launch were filled with restrained relief. Mission objectives were completed methodically: satellite deployments, onboard experiments, systems tests. The crew spoke to mission control with precision, but also with a tone that suggested awareness. They weren't just completing a mission, they were restoring something broken. On the ground, engineers continued to study data. Everything was logged. Every temperature, pressure reading, and signal behavior was examined. Trust had not been granted simply because the mission succeeded. It had to be sustained through discipline. When Discovery landed safely at Edwards Air Force Base on October 3rd, the moment was marked not by fireworks, but by steady applause and a few tears in the control room. Not tears of celebration, but of quiet release. Something had returned, not what had been lost, but the ability to continue. Across NASA, there was a growing realization. The shuttle would fly again, but it would never again be framed as routine. The program had always carried risk, but now, the understanding of that risk was no longer theoretical. Families of the Challenger crew were consulted about future missions. NASA invited them into discussions. Some accepted, some declined. The agency understood now that inclusion was not about public relations, it was about responsibility. The Challenger investigation had left scars, but it had also left a roadmap, a clear, humbling lesson in what happens when systems drift, when dissent is muted, and when urgency replaces rigor. NASA carried that with it into every mission that followed. In 1990, a memorial grove was planted at Johnson Space Center. 7 trees, one for each member of the Challenger crew. No plaque was needed to explain. Those who walked the path knew. The trees stood tall, quietly growing. The shuttle flew again. And again. New astronauts joined the Corps. New payloads were prepared. But the names of those 7 were never far from the surface. Years later, new generations of engineers would read the Challenger report as part of their training. Not just to understand the failure, but to understand the culture behind it. They were told, listen harder than you speak. Question with respect, but with persistence. Document everything. And never assume safety is someone else's job. It was not a clean resolution. It was the beginning of living with what had happened. The sky had never looked the same again, but it was still there. And now, once more, it had been reached. Time passed, but the name Challenger never left. It returned in quiet ways, on plaques in memorial services, in the calm voices of flight directors reading the crew names aloud before launches. Not out of ritual, but out of respect. The kind that settles deep and doesn't require attention to be felt. In the years that followed the return to flight in 1988, NASA continued its missions. The shuttle fleet expanded. New technologies were tested. Crews rotated. The space station era began to take shape. But behind every milestone, every launch, every press release, Challenger remained a fixed point in memory. For those inside the agency, it never became a past event. It lived in training modules, in safety briefings, in the internal voice that asked before every decision, "Are we sure?" The families of the 7 astronauts found different paths through their grief. None of them chose the spotlight, but many found ways to turn loss into education. One of the most visible outcomes was the creation of the Challenger Center for Space Science Education, founded in 1986 by the families. They didn't want the tragedy to be remembered as an end. They wanted it to carry forward as a beginning, for students, for teachers, for those who looked up and wondered. The first center opened in Houston, not far from Johnson Space Center. Then others followed: Virginia, California, Florida, and beyond. Each location offered hands-on learning experiences for school children. Simulated missions, flight control roles, engineering puzzles. Each child played a part. Each student got to see, in some small way, what space meant, not as something far away, but as something they could step into. At the heart of every Challenger Center was a photograph of the crew. Not a dramatic portrait, not a montage, just the original crew photo. 7 people standing shoulder to shoulder, smiling in their flight suits. No one looking heroic, just human. Teachers used that photo not to explain the accident, but to talk about purpose, about risk, about curiosity. Christa McAuliffe, whose presence had drawn so many students to the STS-51L mission, became a symbol not of loss, but of connection. Her famous quote, I touch the future. I teach, was painted on walls, printed in yearbooks, spoken aloud at commencements. A school in her hometown of Concord, New Hampshire, was renamed in her honor. A planetarium was built there too, one that carried her name but offered something else, a sky that could still be reached. Judith Resnick, a brilliant engineer and pianist, had scholarships named after her. Ellison Onizuka's name graced an Air Force station and educational centers in Hawaii. Ronald McNair, who once integrated a public library as a boy in the segregated South, had a college prep program founded in his name to serve students from underrepresented backgrounds. Mike Smith, Dick Scobie, and Gregory Jarvis were honored in similar ways, not with fanfare, but through foundations, lecture halls, and the quiet acknowledgement that what they stood for still mattered. NASA, in turn, made lasting changes, not just in engineering, but in culture. The term Challenger mentality became common among senior flight directors. It referred not to the crew or the accident itself, but to the discipline that followed. The refusal to assume, the insistence on hearing concerns, even when they were inconvenient. Especially then, new astronauts trained with a case study of STS-51L, not to relive it, but to understand the ecosystem that had led to it. They didn't study the explosion. They studied the meetings before it, the engineering notes, the management decisions, the silences. They learned that tragedy often doesn't begin with failure. It begins with deference, with someone hesitating to speak. NASA's Office of Safety was given greater authority. The position of chief engineer was elevated. The flow of dissent was made a formal part of the chain. No longer was silence a signal of agreement. And yet, the change was not without tension. Some within the agency feared that fear itself would paralyze innovation. Others believed that no mission could ever truly be safe, that the nature of exploration was to accept risk. But what Challenger taught was not about avoiding danger. It was about understanding it. It became part of a larger question that NASA and its people would carry for the rest of the shuttle era. How much risk is acceptable for the pursuit of knowledge? And who bears the burden of that risk? In public memory, Challenger became both a caution and a commitment. Every January, around the anniversary, ceremonies were held. Some were large, others were private. At the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex, a memorial wall was created, engraved with the names of the fallen crews of Challenger and, later, Columbia. Beneath the names, a simple inscription: they dared to explore. But more powerful than any structure was the way the names endured in conversation. They weren't referenced as figures. They were remembered as people. Teachers, daughters, husbands, parents, quiet, intelligent, determined people who had accepted a mission not to be icons, but to contribute. In later years, astronauts aboard the International Space Station would speak of Challenger in video calls with schools. They would describe what had changed, how every checklist, every procedure, every training module had been shaped in some way by those who came before, and by those who didn't return. Inside Mission Control, a framed photograph of the crew hung quietly above one console. No label, no spotlight, just a reminder, not to dwell in the past, but not to forget it either. When new flight directors gave their first pre-launch briefings, many paused before beginning. Some acknowledged Challenger directly, others did not, but all of them, those who had read the reports, studied the frames, and listened to the tapes, knew what lay behind their words. They spoke carefully, because they understood that each launch, each flight, each moment in the sky, was not separate from the one in 1986. It was connected, and it always would be. On February 1st, 2003, the sky split open again. Space Shuttle Columbia, the oldest orbiter in the fleet, was returning home after 16 days in orbit. The mission, STS-107, had gone as planned. Science experiments had been conducted, fluids studied in microgravity. Crew members had recorded video messages for students, filmed sunrise over Earth's horizon, laughed in zero gravity. They had packed, cleaned the cabin, secured their equipment, and then, as Columbia passed into the atmosphere, something went wrong. It was early morning in Texas. Residents along the flight path looked up to see long, white streaks cutting across the sky. But they weren't clean lines. They sparkled, fractured. Trails of debris spread outward. Windows shook. The silence of dawn was replaced with the dull roll of shockwaves. There was no impact, no explosion, no single moment to define it, just a slow unraveling. NASA lost contact at 8:59 a.m. Eastern Time, 16 minutes before landing. In mission control, the first few seconds were filled with confusion. Telemetry dropped, then voice, then vital signs. Nothing, and then came a terrible stillness. Those who had lived through Challenger in 1986 didn't need to be told. They knew the pattern. They recognized the silence. It was happening again. 7 lives lost again. Commander Rick Husband, pilot William McCool, payload commander Michael Anderson, mission specialists Elon Ramon, Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, and Laurel Clark. Each one had trained under a program born from the lessons of Challenger. Each had known that safety was the backbone of shuttle flight. And each had boarded Columbia trusting that the system was better now. And in many ways it was, but it wasn't perfect. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board, convened within hours, found the cause. A piece of foam insulation had broken off during launch and struck the leading edge of the left wing. That strike, 81 seconds into flight, created a breach in the thermal protection system. Upon re-entry, hot gases entered the wing and destroyed its internal structure. The crew never knew. It was a different failure than Challenger, a different cause. But to those inside NASA, it felt familiar. Too familiar. Because once again, the technical flaw had been known, at least in part. Foam shedding had been seen before. Engineers had expressed concern, but launch continued. Once again, a problem had become normalized. And once again, it had cost lives. For the families of Challenger, the news of Columbia was not distant. It reopened something that had never fully closed. The calls began again. Journalists, NASA staff, public statements, interviews. The weight of loss shifted back to the forefront. Some of the Challenger families reached out directly to the families of Columbia. Not with advice, not with guidance, just presence. A shared understanding that had no words. The public, too, recognized the echo. They remembered the smoke trail in 1986. They now watched debris fall again, this time not into the Atlantic, but across the pine forests and rural fields of East Texas. Wreckage was scattered across hundreds of miles. Pieces of the orbiter were found by farmers, sheriffs, volunteers. Remains of the crew were recovered with care, again under military escort. And again, there was no fanfare, only silence. In schools, teachers explained it all over again. Not just the technical facts, but the meaning. Students born after Challenger now learned about 2 disasters. 2 shuttles, 14 people. NASA grounded the fleet. Again, and inside the agency, there was a familiar reckoning. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board, CAIB, reviewed organizational structures. Safety procedures, chain of command, dissent, just like the Rogers Commission had done before. Their conclusion was clear. Technical failure had occurred, but cultural failure had allowed it. Again, they referenced Challenger directly in the report, not just as history, but as an unresolved lesson. They used phrases like echoes of Challenger and lessons not fully absorbed. They pointed to the normalization of risk, the silencing of concern, the pressure of schedule. The cycle had repeated. In the wake of Columbia, memorials were held at Kennedy, at Johnson, at Arlington. A new section was added to the memorial wall. 7 more names, new photographs, new biographies. But the feeling was not only grief. It was fatigue, a kind of spiritual exhaustion that moved through the agency. Some wondered aloud whether the shuttle program could continue. Others believed it had to, because walking away meant letting go of something that had once united and inspired. Yet few denied that something fundamental had broken. Again, for those who remembered Challenger, this was not a fresh pain, but an old one revisited. The language had not changed. Failure of imagination, breakdown in communication, avoidable, It was difficult to say the words again, but it was harder to remain silent. NASA eventually returned to flight, again with Discovery, in 2005. But this time, the understanding was different. There would be no third time. The shuttle fleet was scheduled to retire, and the agency began planning for a different era. But Challenger was never just about the shuttle. It was about memory, about the cost of assumption, about the human voice within a system that doesn't always hear it. In 2008, on the 25th anniversary of the first shuttle mission, a NASA administrator stood at the Kennedy Space Center and said quietly, "We don't fly for glory. We fly because we believe there is more to learn." And behind him, the names were there again. McAuliffe, Onizuka, Resnick, McNair, Smith, Jarvis, Scobie, not elevated as saints, but held in permanent recognition, not just for what they attempted, but for what they taught by never returning. That memory did not fade in 2003. It deepened. It connected generations of astronauts, engineers, and students in an unspoken pact. To remember is not to dwell. To remember is to refuse to forget. And in that, the Challenger 7 remained quietly, steadily, part of every mission that followed. By the late 2000s, the shuttle's time was drawing to a close. The orbiters had flown dozens of missions since the return to flight. Satellites were deployed, laboratories were assembled in orbit. The International Space Station became a permanent fixture above Earth. Crews rotated in and out, seasoned astronauts, first-time flyers, international partners. But no one in the program believed the shuttle was eternal, and no one imagined it could be. From the beginning, it had been a remarkable machine, part rocket, part spacecraft, part airplane. It could carry people and cargo. It could glide home. But it was never simple, and it was never entirely safe. After Columbia, the risks had been reevaluated again. Foam strikes were monitored. Cameras were installed on the fuel tank and on the solid rocket boosters. Astronauts were trained to inspect the shuttle from orbit, using robotic arms and cameras. Contingency plans were refined, but it was understood increasingly that no amount of innovation could eliminate risk altogether. The shuttle had become a masterpiece of engineering and a monument to compromise. It had done more than anyone first imagined, and more than it was truly designed to do. President George W. Bush announced the end of the program in 2004. The final flights would support station construction and scientific payloads, but by 2011, the orbiters would be retired. NASA's focus would shift, back to the Moon, toward Mars, to new designs, new partners, but the shuttle would not be replaced. As the final missions approached, there was a change in tone across the agency. Not regret, but reflection. At launch events, speakers often paused to honor the past. Visitors to Kennedy Space Center were shown both triumph and tragedy. And at every major mission milestone, the names of Challenger's crew were acknowledged, sometimes with words, sometimes with silence. New astronauts, those who had grown up watching shuttle launches in classrooms, carried that memory with them. Some had been children when Challenger was lost. Others were not yet born. But none of them entered the program without learning what had come before. Training still included the Rogers Commission report. Still included 73 seconds of footage that could never be unwatched. In quiet sessions, instructors explained the culture before Challenger. The assumptions, the chain of decisions, the human cost. Not to instill fear, but to create awareness. To remind them that flight was never just about mechanics. It was about voices, and the cost of ignoring them. At Johnson Space Center, the portraits remained in the astronaut hallway, row after row of crew photos from every mission. The STS 51L portrait hung among them, not marked differently, not set apart. Just there, like the others, but different in the eyes of everyone who passed. Mission control had changed too. The consoles were newer, the screens clearer, but the language remained precise and the reverence unchanged. Flight directors still used Challenger as a reference point, not to relive the accident, but to remember where the boundary was crossed. In the training simulators, emergency scenarios were practiced with intensity. Crew egress procedures. onboard fire drills, loss of pressure. No one assumed that any problem was too small to be fatal. That mindset, the one that had cost lives, was no longer part of the system. Outside of NASA, the memory of Challenger took root in quiet places. Schools named for Christa McAuliffe continued to teach new generations. Libraries bearing the names of Resnick, McNair, Onizuka stood in small towns and cities. The Challenger Learning Centers remained active, expanding into more communities. They reached students who had never seen a shuttle launch, but who understood what it meant to reach upward. There were no monuments of stone for Challenger that tried to erase its sorrow. Only spaces, classrooms, gardens, plaques where learning could continue. That, more than anything, had been the intention of the families. Not to preserve the grief, but to transform it. In 2010, the final year of the program, NASA began preparing for the last flight. The Shuttle Atlantis, veteran of over 30 missions, would carry the flag of conclusion. STS-135 was not just a delivery mission to the ISS. It was the closing chapter of a long and complicated book. The launch was scheduled for July 8, 2011. Crowds gathered. Former astronauts returned. Engineers who had worked on the program in the 1980s stood beside interns who had just arrived. They shared stories, memories, caution. Among the guests were family members of the Challenger crew. Not all attended, but those who came were met with quiet gestures, nods, handshakes, space. They did not ask to be recognized, but they were. When Atlantis rose from the pad that morning, it carried more than cargo. It carried finality. The last shuttle launch went smoothly. The orbiter docked, delivered supplies, undocked, and returned home. It landed in the pre-dawn light of Florida, wheels touching down softly on a runway that had seen triumph, failure, and everything between. And just like that, the shuttle era was over. The orbiters were sent to museums, Discovery to the Smithsonian, Atlantis to Kennedy Space Center, Endeavour to Los Angeles. Columbia remained with investigators, a recovered wreckage never rebuilt. And Challenger, its remains stored in a quiet silo at Cape Canaveral, was never displayed. Never made a monument, because it didn't need to be. Its legacy was already written, not in wreckage, but in the questions it forced into the center of spaceflight. Why do we go? Who do we send? What do we owe them? Those questions remained. And in every future mission, robotic or human, lunar or planetary, they would be carried forward. Time doesn't erase the Challenger. It simply changes how it's remembered. In the years after the shuttle program ended, the names of the 7 crew members remained spoken, not just by those who knew them, but by those who hadn't been born when they died. They were remembered not through dramatic retellings, but through still moments, quiet memorials in school auditoriums, brief nods in training sessions, handwritten notes on the walls of science classrooms. In the minds of astronauts who flew after them, the Challenger crew were not ghosts or symbols. They were real people, and their presence wasn't carried in superstition, but in protocol. In the voice that asked questions no one wanted to answer. In the decision to delay a launch, despite the cost. In the extra review of a checklist. In a hesitation that was allowed to exist and to be heard. They lived in those margins. Every year, NASA held a day of remembrance. Held in winter. Always quiet. Flowers were laid beneath the memorial wall at Kennedy. In Houston, astronauts and administrators stood before a simple stone and bowed their heads. A bell rang. 7 times. 1 for Scobie. 1 for Smith. 1 for Resnick. 4 McNair. 4 Jarvis. 4 Onizuka. 4 McAuliffe. No one gave long speeches. That was never what the crew had asked for. Most of them had disliked ceremony. They had trained to fly, to work, to contribute. And yet, what they became was larger than the mission. They became a shape in the sky that never settled. A story that didn't resolve. And the nation held on to it, not always with clarity, but always with weight. In the years following their loss, Challenger appeared in art, in film, in novels. But always in fragments. Always as a moment that couldn't be fully touched. Because the story defied ending. It didn't offer resolution. It asked questions instead. How can you disappear in daylight with millions watching? What does it mean to fall from the sky without warning? Where does the meaning live? In the moment of failure, or in what came after? Some students wrote essays about McAuliffe, describing her as brave. Others drew pictures of the shuttle arcing upward. A few said they wanted to be astronauts still, that they weren't afraid, that they understood. But understanding in the shadow of Challenger was never complete. It came in layers. It came in knowing that the rocket still burns, even when the odds shift. That calculation doesn't erase consequence. That loss can live beside purpose without defeating it. In quiet ways, the story of Challenger shaped how the country thought about space. Not as a frontier of destiny, but as a realm of choice, of margin, of restraint. By the 2020s, new vehicles were being built. Private companies launched spacecraft with commercial logos. New names appeared: Crew Dragon, Starliner, Artemis. The conversation around space shifted again, toward sustainability, toward the moon, toward Mars. But inside those capsules, astronauts still trained with Challenger in mind. Its legacy was embedded, not in the machines, but in the behaviors. In 2021, NASA introduced a new safety framework that required all mission plans to go through independent review teams empowered to override any schedule. Engineers called it a Challenger clause. It wasn't written that way, but everyone knew what it meant. It meant speak. It meant delay if unsure. It meant no silence. Families of the crew aged. Some passed away. Others lived long enough to see the story continue in ways they could not have imagined. The children of the astronauts became adults. Many stayed out of the public eye. A few visited museums quietly. One or two spoke at commemorations, not as representatives, but as witnesses. They did not speak in anger, only in memory. They reminded audiences that the crew had not set out to be remembered this way, that they had not asked to become symbols, that they were people who loved books and music and late-night talks and ordinary breakfasts, that they had laughed in the simulator, that they had left notes for their children, that they had believed it would be safe, and that it should have been. When the final report of the Challenger Commission was digitized and released into the public domain, educators across the country began assigning it in engineering ethics courses. Not as history, but as warning. In those classrooms, students read about booster joints and pressure seals. But more importantly, they read the margins, the meetings, the memos, the silences. They discussed how organizations drift, how confidence becomes habit, how people don't fail in a single moment, but in many moments that go unnoticed. They read the words "go for launch" and understood them differently now, not as triumph, but as decision. And slowly, without spectacle, Challenger became part of the framework through which risk was understood. Not just in spaceflight, but in medicine, in industry, in any system where life and decision meet. There were no new lessons after Challenger, only the same ones, made unignorable. In the years since the accident, Challenger has remained part of the foundation of spaceflight in the United States, not as a distant tragedy, but as a permanent reference point. Its memory lives quietly inside the decisions made at every level of NASA, not in slogans or monuments, but in the checks, the pauses, the conversations that happen behind closed doors before any vehicle leaves the ground. At Kennedy Space Center, a secure facility stores the recovered remnants of the orbiter. The remains are not on display. They are studied, occasionally referenced in safety reviews, but never treated as symbols. Their purpose is not memorial, they serve only to inform. Across the country, schools and public buildings carry the names of the crew. Not in grand architectural statements, but in ordinary places. Libraries, classrooms, learning centers, where the focus remains on education and access. The Challenger Learning Centers continue to operate. In them, students role-play space missions, learn to solve problems under pressure, and are encouraged to think critically. The centers exist because the families of the crew wanted something more than remembrance. They wanted continuity. NASA's newer astronauts still learn the Challenger timeline as part of their training. The details of the launch, the decision processes, the weather data, the final 73 seconds. They are asked not to memorize, but to understand. to know the difference between system failure and human misjudgment, between silence and uncertainty, between confidence and caution. Most of those who were working inside NASA at the time of Challenger are now gone, retired, passed away, but the institution still carries their decisions and the weight of what followed. The Rogers Commission report remains one of the most cited documents in aerospace training. Its language is dry, methodical, but its conclusions are clear. It is not about the explosion. It is about what led up to it. The Shuttle program ended in 2011. Challenger's name was not part of the closure ceremony, but it was felt. Everyone there knew that the story of the Shuttle could never be told without that day in January 1986. The crew's families chose how to carry their grief privately. Some participated in public ceremonies. Others did not, but none sought to shape the narrative. They asked only that the loss not be simplified, not made dramatic, and not forgotten. That request has largely been respected. When students learn about Challenger today, it is usually not through film clips or memorial speeches. It is through cause and effect diagrams, through system analysis, through quiet conversations about ethics, responsibility, and the value of speaking up. That is the legacy. It doesn't require retelling. It requires remembering. And that is what has happened. Not with noise, not with ceremony, but with care.